My name is Vesper Vance. I just turned 34. I spend most of my waking hours balancing on scaffolding in drafty municipal buildings, matching colored pigments, soldering lead came, and letting podcasts about historical maritime disasters drown out the property manager complaining about the previous contractor's leaky roof repairs. It isn't a glamorous existence. It demands intense, unforgiving precision, which fits my personality perfectly. Julian and I lasted almost exactly 3 years. We called it quits on a rainy Tuesday in October. We managed the split with that awful, polite civility reserved for two people who realize the spark died months ago, yet they still fundamentally care for one another. Nobody played the bad guy. The breakups that carve the deepest scars usually lack one. He finally admitted we were growing into entirely different people. I stared at my cold coffee cup and agreed with him. We sat in terrible silence for a few long minutes. He teared up. I held it together. Afterward, I drove back to my tiny duplex, ate cold leftover lo mein at midnight, and wondered why the right choices always echo with such dead silence. That quiet Tuesday happened roughly 8 months before Arthur, Julian's father, rang my cell on a freezing Tuesday morning. Arthur was 61. He ran a niche hardware shop downtown, carrying himself with that specific gravity belonging to men who survived raising chaotic boys. He emerged with a sparse vocabulary and absolutely zero patience for inefficiency. He never wasted breath on fragments, treating every sentence like a contract. When Arthur made a choice, he executed it immediately. We clicked right from the start. A fact I knew wasn't a given. He studied me like a puzzle during my first year with Julian. Then he dropped the scrutiny and simply started treating me like family. When Julian and I split, Arthur phoned me exactly once. He didn't ask for gossip. He bluntly stated his regrets, told me I was a brilliant woman, and made sure he knew he thought highly of me. On this particular Tuesday, he declared he had a logistical nightmare. He was overhauling his upstairs study and bought a massive, solid oak drafting desk. The delivery crew dumped it in the foyer. He needed muscle and someone who understood sharp angles. I told him I'd be there Saturday, convincing myself it was a simple favor. I told myself I was just helping an older man I admired. When someone asks for help, I show up. It's a reflex, not a calculated game of chess to wedge myself back into Julian's orbit. I repeated this lie to my rearview mirror on Thursday. I whispered it again Friday night. By Saturday morning, I'd muttered it so often I finally recognized the familiar rhythm of a liar selling a bad pitch. This was Julian's father. We were wrestling a desk up a staircase. I pulled my truck up to Arthur's historic brick house right at 8:30. The January air bit at my lungs, but his long driveway was already salted and shoveled bare. A fresh winter wreath hung on the heavy oak door, and the rich scent of dark roast coffee spilled out when he yanked it open. He hadn't changed a bit. Why would he? Only 8 months had passed. He wore his reading glasses on a chain, smelling of sawdust. "Vesper," he murmured, stepping aside. "Get in before we freeze." I stepped into the hallway. We stood there with that shifting energy you feel entering a familiar space you haven't seen in a year, relaxed but undeniably guarded. He answered with the quiet pride of a man whose obscure skills kept his bills paid. The oak drafting desk sat exactly where he said, a monolithic beast built heavy enough to survive a bomb blast. We stood at the bottom of the stairs, calculating the physics of the stairwell. I pointed out a nasty pivot near the second-floor landing, suggesting we tilt the frame backward before we hit the corner. He nodded, mentioning he saw the same trap. We managed the beast in 3 agonizing pushes. That was quicker than I guessed. Arthur didn't just hover and dictate. He felt the weight shift before I even warned him. He dropped his shoulder, matched my breathing, and paused the second my grip slipped. He possessed the rare physical intuition of a guy who spent decades wrestling heavy objects alone. We shoved it flat against the far wall of his study. I wiped sweat off my forehead and inspected our work. Arthur stood shoulder to shoulder with me. "Nasty pivot," he grunted. Nasty pivot, I echoed. He wandered off to fetch water. I took in the room, stripped walls smelling of primer, rolled up Persian rugs shoved into the closet. He was gutting the place. Arthur returned with 2 heavy crystal tumblers. He handed me a glass, stared at the massive desk, then stared out the frosted window. Finally, he looked straight at me. He placed his drink on the radiator. Without a word, he walked over to the study door and pushed it shut. The heavy brass latch clicked with a deafening snap in the quiet house. He turned back around. "We need to talk," Arthur stated. I want to explain exactly what happened in my stomach right then. I didn't panic. It felt more like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, knowing the ice is about to crack, just waiting for the plunge. "All right," I muttered. He dragged a folding chair over, sat down heavily, and locked his eyes on mine. He wore the expression of a man who spent all night drafting a speech to make sure he didn't lie. "I'm going to tell you a fact," he started, his voice dropping an octave, "and I need you to bite your tongue until I am completely finished. Understood?" I nodded once. "Julian is engaged," he said flatly. "Happened last week. I am not telling you this to twist the knife. I am telling you this because you deserve the truth." I kept my expression completely blank. "I didn't know," I replied quietly, "but I appreciate the honesty." Arthur gave a single sharp nod. "My son is a decent kid who made a decision he thinks is right, though it might blow up in ways he lacks the maturity to see yet. I am his father, I love him, and I am not sitting here to prosecute his choices or defend them." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I brought you here because I have my own perspective, completely separate from Julian. I have swallowed it for 8 damn months. I am 61 years old, Vesper, and I am entirely out of patience for keeping my mouth shut." I didn't dare move a muscle. "You were the finest partner my son ever brought home," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Not the flashiest, not the loudest, the best. You were a rock. You were fiercely honest. When you said you'd do something, it got done, and you treated him with a rare kind of respect." He stopped, swallowing hard. "You also treated me like a human being, not the boyfriend's grumpy old dad, an actual person." I picked up on that. I tend to catch those details. I kept my mouth shut, though, honoring his request to let him finish. "My son isn't the point of this talk," Arthur clarified, setting his glass on the desk. "Not really." He shifted a stack of blueprints on his work table, ran a thumb over the edge, and looked back up. "I have a close acquaintance. His name is Gideon. He's 41, a structural engineer who handles bridge restorations for the county. He's been on his own for 3 years now. He has a 9-year-old boy named Tage, who is easily the most eccentric, genuinely hilarious kid I've ever encountered, and I don't say that to be polite." He took a slow breath. "Gideon has been my sounding board and closest friend for over a decade. I know his moral compass the way I know the inventory in my shop. I know the wreckage he walked out of, I know what he deserves, and I know exactly the kind of woman who would ground him." He locked his eyes on mine. "I've been weighing you since October. Not like an obsession, just a recurring thought that kept making sense. I wondered if it would be inappropriate, if it would stir up drama, or if Julian would throw a tantrum." "I wondered," Arthur continued, "if Julian even has a right to complain, given how things shook out. I wondered if it was my business to interfere." He paused, waiting for my reaction. "And?" I asked. "I decided it was," he said flatly. "Not to play matchmaker or force anyone into a corner, just to hand you the facts, plant the seed, and then completely pull back and let whatever happens happen." He rested his calloused hands on his knees with the absolute stillness of a man who makes a hard choice and owns it completely. "Gideon has no idea I'm dropping this on you. I want to be entirely transparent about that. If he found out, he'd probably lose his mind out of sheer embarrassment, But I also know with absolute certainty that he wouldn't hate the final result, and I don't use words lightly. He stood up from his folding chair. "That's the whole pitch," he said. "I'm not forcing your hand. I'm not guaranteeing it's a perfect match or that it won't crash and burn. I'm simply saying you're a remarkable woman who deserves a real, steady life, and I happen to know a man trying to piece one together." He's been working on the same puzzle for 8 months, and I officially decided that staying quiet was worse than speaking up. Now, those heavy rubber workbench mats still need to be laid down if you can spare 20 minutes, Arthur added. There wasn't a drop of romance in that scene, just an aging hardware dealer standing in a dusty, stripped-down study, delivering an incredibly heavy truth he'd carried for months, then immediately asking for manual labor. I appreciate that style. I'm telling you this because the moments that actually redirect your life rarely happen under spotlights. They happen in rooms that smell like industrial primer, spoken by regular people who decided that being honest matters more than being comfortable. We unrolled the thick rubber black mats together. We talked about winter road conditions. He didn't bring up Gideon again, and I didn't push it, which was the smartest move we could have made. He pointed out an old iron-framed architectural sketch he intended to mount on the brick wall. I showed him where the afternoon light wouldn't cause a glare. He agreed. Before I walked out to my truck, he slid a small cardboard business card into my palm. Gideon's name was printed on the front, along with his direct office line, and Arthur had scrawled a brief note in graphite across the back. "Tell him I put you up to it. He'll understand." I drove back to my place and left that card sitting on my kitchen counter for days. I have an incredibly hard time handling situations that require me to do absolutely nothing, so forcing myself to sit still and simply chew on his suggestion felt like a chore. I let it simmer for 3 full days. On the third night, a Friday, I finally pulled up my email. It took me 4 separate drafts to hit the right note. Not because the words were complicated, but because I wanted to strip out any fake bravado or unnecessary hesitation. I didn't want to sound desperate, but I didn't want to play a character either. I wrote, "My name is Vesper. A mutual contact gave me your details. I know this comes entirely out of nowhere. If you're open to it, I'd love to grab a coffee sometime soon. No pressure whatsoever." I hit send at a few minutes past 7. My phone buzzed at 7:42. His reply was brief. "Arthur warned me that you don't mince words. This is exactly as direct as advertised. Yes to coffee. I can do Sunday afternoon if that suits." I'd love to tell you that meeting was frictionless, but that would be a lie. Sitting down with a stranger who already holds a second-hand blueprint of your personality creates an odd tension. You're constantly weighing what they've been told against the flesh and blood humans sitting across the table. Luckily, Gideon was another person who seemed to have run completely out of patience for social filler. We burned through the awkward introductory phase in about 15 minutes. By the half-hour mark, the performance dropped away completely. We were just talking. He possessed a dry, gravelly humor, laughing at small asides I hadn't even realized were funny. That's a rare sort of comfort, when someone catches your wavelength without you having to explain the joke. He spoke about his son Tage with that specific, vulnerable pride that catches a guarded parent completely off guard. He mentioned the kid had spent the winter constructing a handwritten index of entirely fabricated machine parts. Gideon explained that Taj had already cataloged 12 imaginary inventions, including a specific name for the feeling of reaching into a coat pocket and finding exactly the tool you forgot you needed. He delivered this with the deadpan gravity of a scientist describing a major breakthrough. I told him that specific feeling absolutely earned a spot in the language. He smiled and said Taj called it stray iron. That stuck with me. Our quick coffee stretched into 2 hours, which turned into a 40-minute walk through the cold riverfront brick alleys without either of us planning the detour. That's usually the sign that matters. He asked about my stained glass restoration work with genuine curiosity, asking the kind of mechanical questions that proved he was listening. I asked about bridge logistics and found myself genuinely hooked by his description of river currents and concrete stress points. My eyes didn't even glaze over during the drainage talk, which he noted with a grin. He never brought up Julian, and I never offered a word about my ex. Arthur's name surfaced exactly once, and we both handled it with the easy shorthand of two grown adults who acknowledged the setup was bizarre but chose not to make it weird. Gideon called Arthur a force of nature. I told him I'd learned that firsthand in a room that smelled of wall primer. He laughed. I rang Arthur the following morning. He picked up before the second ring could finish. "Well," he grunted. I told him the afternoon went well. "I know," he replied. "He called me last night." I let out a sharp, surprised laugh, the kind you make when you realize you're a step behind the information loop. Arthur chuckled too, a deep, relaxed sound that made him seem remarkably light. "I'm out of the loop from here on," he promised, and he kept his word. He never pried again. Months down the road, when Tage finally met me with that terrifyingly intense focus that 9-year-olds use to judge adults, he lined up 3 specific questions. First, did I think his machine index was actual science? Second, did I understand what stray iron meant? Third, was I a dog person or did I prefer reptiles? The final question had a weight that suggested it carried the entire interview. I told him the index was critical research. I said stray iron was brilliant. I said I preferred big dogs. He weighed my face for 5 long seconds, checking for lies. "Acceptable," he muttered, returning to his sketchbook. Gideon, leaning against the counter behind him, caught my eye and bit his lip to keep from bursting out laughing. A year later, when acquaintances asked how we crossed paths, Gideon would smile and say a mutual contact put us in touch. It was a clean answer that preserved the structural bones of the truth without airing the laundry. The real version, Arthur's 8 months of quiet observation, a closed door in a half-finished study, a scrawled graphite note on a business card, that was reserved for the inner circle. And their reaction was always identical. They'd shake their heads and say Arthur was a remarkable man who should have been running a small republic. I pulled up to Arthur's hardware shop in April, exactly 12 months after that first Sunday coffee. I didn't warn him. I walked through the door carrying a tin of high-grade polishing oil for his vintage tools and a card that simply read, "Thanks for opening your mouth." He glanced at the writing, then up at me. His reading glasses were propped on his forehead, identical to that freezing winter morning. He had a fresh smudge of grease on his forearm, right where he'd been working on a customer's antique latch. "You look solid," he stated. It wasn't a guess. "I am," I replied. "Good," Arthur muttered, sliding the card back across the counter because he isn't a man who keeps unnecessary paperwork. "Now sit down and give me the rundown on how he's doing. He never tells me the actual details." I took a seat on an overturned wooden crate and told him everything. Outside the dusty window, April was doing its usual rainy routine. The oil I brought was better than his cheap shop supply, and he admitted it, which was his version of a rave review. Nothing beautiful had dropped out of the sky. It was constructed piece by piece, by an old man who trusted his gut and acted, and by 2 people who were ready for something permanent, without realizing it until the space felt right. I still think about that closed door. Some truths require a room you can't escape until the words are spoken. Arthur understood that. He prepped the space, locked the latch, and spoke. The rest was up to us. What would you do if your ex's father cornered you with a life-changing piece of advice that turned out to be completely accurate? Have you ever had someone see a spark in you before you even recognized it yourself? Let me know down in the comments. If this story stuck with you, smash that like button, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.